The room was full of pastel tissue paper and polite laughter when my daughter looked at my hand hovering over a baby blanket and said, so quietly everyone heard it, "Please don't touch her things. You signed away that right a long time ago." I remember my smile freezing before I understood the words. I remember the air changing. And I remember thinking, with a coldness I still can't describe, signed what? For a few seconds, nobody moved. One woman near the cake stand let out a nervous little laugh, the kind people make when they're sure they've heard something wrong and are waiting for someone else to fix it. My daughter didn't correct herself. She just stood there with one hand resting low on her stomach, her eyes bright and wounded in a way I had never seen turned toward me before. There were pink paper plates stacked beside the punch bowl. Someone had hung little gold stars from the curtain rod. There was a bowl of mints on the coffee table, and one of them had rolled onto the carpet and come to rest near my shoe. I noticed all of it because I could not yet look directly at what had just happened. I was 55 years old, standing in a living room full of women who had watched me raise that girl, and in one sentence I had become a stranger. At first, I thought I misunderstood. I would tell myself later. Looking back, I think that was my mind trying to protect me. The human heart does that sometimes. It buys you a second or two before it lets the truth all the way in. I pulled my hand back from the blanket. It was a soft yellow one, hand-stitched with tiny white edging. I had spent 3 weeks making it, one careful loop at a time, sitting by my front window in the evenings. I had imagined my granddaughter wrapped in it on some rainy morning while Hannah rocked her in that old pine chair I had refinished for the nursery. My daughter didn't know that yet. She didn't know I had sanded that chair twice because the first finish looked too dark. She didn't know because for the last month she had slowly stepped away from me, inch by inch, message by message, until that moment in her friend, Melissa's living room when she finally said out loud what she'd apparently been carrying. I should tell you that my daughter's name is Hannah. She is 31. She has my hands and her father's chin. When she was little, she had this way of pressing her lips together when she was trying not to cry, and she was doing it that afternoon, except she wasn't little anymore, and I was not the one she was trying to come to. I was the one she was trying to keep away. Melissa, who had known Hannah since middle school, set down a gift bag and said, "Why don't we all just take a breath?" But nobody breathed. Not really. The room was too full of what had already been said. I looked at Hannah and asked, very softly, "Honey, what are you talking about?" She flinched at honey. That hurt more than the words. "You know exactly what I'm talking about," she said. And that was the moment something inside me shifted. Not broke. Shifted. Breaking is loud. This was quieter than that. More like the feeling of a foundation settling under a house, a slow recognition that what held you safely for years might not be steady anymore. The women started finding reasons to look elsewhere. One pretended to rearrange cupcakes. Another checked her phone. I caught my reflection in the dark television screen over Melissa's fireplace and barely recognized myself in it. Same short hair I'd worn for years, soft blonde gone natural with gray at the temples now. Same careful face I had carried through divorce and debt and long work days and empty nest silence. But in that reflection, I looked as if someone had walked up behind me and removed a piece of my life without warning. "I don't," I said. "I really don't." Hannah stared at me for one beat too long, like she was deciding whether I was lying or simply shameless. Then she shook her head and turned away. "I can't do this today." It would have been easier if she had screamed, easier if she had thrown me out. Quiet rejection leaves more room for humiliation. It asks you to understand your own exile while everyone watches. So I picked up my purse from the side table. I put the yellow blanket back into the gift bag with both hands because my fingers had started to tremble. I told Melissa I was sorry. I told Hannah I loved her. She did not answer. Her friend Keisha stepped closer to her, one protective hand on her elbow, and that, too, I noticed. I noticed everything then. The way people reposition themselves around pain. The way a room can form a boundary without anyone naming it. I left before the game started. When I got to my car, I sat behind the wheel with the door still open. It was late April in Ohio, one of those gray spring afternoons that never fully commits to warmth. I could smell damp pavement, and the powdery sweetness of the baby lotion gift set someone had tucked into my bag by me. I closed the car door and just sat there, both hands on the steering wheel, feeling my pulse in my wrists. You have to understand, this hadn't come out of nowhere exactly. It felt sudden, but it hadn't been sudden. Looking back, I can see the trail now. The missed calls she didn't return. The way her texts got shorter. The fact that she stopped sending me photos of nursery paint samples after weeks of asking my opinion on every shade. The way she said she was tired when I suggested lunch, then somehow had energy to go spend an entire Saturday at her father's lake place. At first, I ignored it. Pregnancy changes people. Fatigue changes people. Marriage changes people. I told myself all the things women tell themselves when they are trying not to feel a door closing. I have done that my whole life, if I'm honest. I have mistaken silence for stress, distance for busyness, because the alternative was to admit I was losing something and I didn't know why. The drive home took 22 minutes. I know because I checked the clock at every red light, as if time might explain what my daughter had just accused me of. By the time I pulled into my driveway, there was a hollow place under my ribs that hadn't been there that morning. My house is small. 2 bedrooms, white siding, old maple tree out front, deep porch with a swing that creaks a little when the weather changes. After my divorce, it was the first place I'd ever lived in that felt like mine in a peaceful way. Not mine because I fought for it. Mine because I could finally exhale there. That afternoon it looked unfamiliar. The azaleas along the walkway had just started to bloom. I remember seeing them and thinking, absurdly, that flowers have terrible timing. The world keeps opening itself right in front of you when part of your life is shutting down. I carried the gift bag inside and set it on the kitchen table. Then I stood there staring at it. The yellow blanket rested on top, folded neatly, innocent as anything. Beside it was the little board book I'd bought called Goodnight, Moonlight Baby. There was a set of washcloths shaped like ducks, a wooden rattle, a card I hadn't sealed yet because I'd wanted to write something personal after the shower, something about Hannah becoming a mother and how proud I was of the tenderness I already saw in her. I opened the card and read what I had written so far. To my sweet girl, this baby is already so loved. I sat down in the nearest chair and pressed my hand over my mouth. I didn't cry right away. I want to be honest about that. People think pain always arrives in tears, but sometimes it arrives in stillness. Sometimes it's a woman in her kitchen at 4:30 in the afternoon, staring at a card she can no longer give and trying to understand how her child has suddenly begun speaking to her in the language of accusation. The first text from Hannah came an hour later. I need some time. Please don't contact me for a while. I'm serious, Mom. Not Mom with a heart like she used to do. Not Mama, which she sometimes called me when she was feeling soft. Just Mom, flat and formal. I read it 6 times. My thumb hovered over the screen. Every response I drafted felt wrong. Too defensive. Too desperate. Too confused. In the end I wrote, I'll give you space. But I need you to know I love you and I truly do not understand what you believe happened. When you're ready, I'm here. The little status bubble never appeared. No 3 dots, no answer. That night I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face in Melissa's living room. Not angry exactly. Hurt. Hurt is more dangerous than anger because it believes itself. Anger can be temporary. Hurt builds a home inside a person and starts hanging curtains. Around 2 in the morning, I got up and made tea I didn't drink. My kitchen clock ticks louder at night. I sat at the table in the dim yellow light over the stove and started replaying the last 6 weeks. It had begun, I think, when Hannah told me she was pregnant. She had come over on a Sunday afternoon in February carrying a paper bag from the bakery downtown. Her cheeks were pink from the cold. She still walked into my house without knocking the way she had since childhood, calling out, "You decent?" Even though it was just me and had just been me for years. I was standing at the counter in my old blue cardigan, slicing oranges, and she put the bakery bag down and slid an envelope toward me. "What's this?" I asked. "Open it." Inside was a tiny white onesie with lemons on it and a note that said, "You're getting promoted." I looked up at her, and there she was, biting that same inside corner of her lip like she had when she was little and trying not to smile too soon. I think I made a sound before I said any words. One of those helpless sounds that comes from someplace older than language. Then she laughed, and I laughed, and she came around the counter and folded herself into my arms. I can sigh. Feel the weight of that moment, her head against my shoulder. My hand rubbing her back the way it did when she was feverish at 6 or heartbroken at 16. The smell of cold air in her hair. She said, "Don't cry yet," and of course I cried anyway. That was my daughter. That was us. For the next few weeks she called constantly. She sent me screenshots of cribs, nursery themes, prenatal vitamins, strollers she couldn't decide between. She asked if I still had the little ceramic rabbit that used to sit on her dresser. She asked what she'd been like as a newborn. She asked if I had cravings when I was pregnant with her. We stood in the baby aisle at Target one Saturday comparing diaper pails like it was serious research. She leaned into me in line while we waited to pay. She let me put a hand on her barely there stomach in the parking lot. She said, "I still can't believe I'm somebody's mom." Then, gradually, without any one dramatic event, she began to move differently around me. A text answered after 6 hours instead of 6 minutes. A lunch canceled. A doctor's appointment I assumed I was coming to until she said Nate was taking off work and there wasn't room. The nursery paint she chose, without asking me, after making color swatches half her personality for a month. A Sunday dinner at her father's place she mentioned casually, then another, then another. Richard had always had impeccable timing when it came to my daughter's vulnerable moments. That is one of the many things I only fully understood after I was no longer married to him. He knew when to appear. He knew when to sound gentle. He knew how to step into emotional openings that other people were too tired or too trusting to guard. We had been divorced for 27 years, and I still felt a tightening in my shoulders when I said his name out loud. Richard was the kind of man people describe as charming when they do not have to live with him. He knew how to hold a room. He knew how to make a waiter laugh, how to remember a stranger's dog's name, how to say exactly the thing that made him sound attentive and kind. He also knew how to punish silence with silence, how to turn ordinary disagreements into moral failures, how to make a woman feel as if she were constantly one apology away from peace. For a long time, I thought that was just marriage. Not the whole thing, but part of it. I was young. My own mother had been a quiet woman who called endurance grace, and I inherited that language before I knew enough to question it. By the time I finally left Richard, Hannah was 3. I'm getting ahead of myself, but this is the trouble with telling a story like this. The present keeps dragging old things into the light. A sentence said in a decorated living room can reach back 30 years and lay a hand on paperwork you thought had turned to dust. The next morning after the shower, I went to work anyway. I'm a billing coordinator at a physical therapy clinic. Nothing glamorous. Rows of codes and insurance forms and phone calls about deductibles. The kind of job that teaches you the world keeps asking practical things of you, no matter what your heart is doing. I sat at my desk under fluorescent lights and tried to make numbers line up while the receptionist chatted about somebody's new puppy in the front office. At 10:13, I opened Hannah's text again. At 10:48, I closed it. At noon, I went to the break room, unwrapped a turkey sandwich, and stared at it until one of the younger women asked if I was feeling okay. I said, didn't sleep much, because it was easier than saying, my daughter looked at me yesterday like I had stolen something from her life. That afternoon, my phone buzzed with a message from my sister Elaine. Melissa called me. What happened? I stared at those words for a long moment. Elaine is 3 years older than I am and has the practical steadiness of a woman who has seen enough storms not to announce every cloud. We are different in temperament. I tend to soften first and analyze later. Elaine notices the weak board in the floor before anybody steps through it. I have resented that about her at times. I have also been saved by it. I called her from my car after work. She answered on the second ring, honey. That one word nearly undid me. I told her what happened, every detail I could remember. The blanket, the phrase, Hannah's face, the silence in the room. By the time I finished, Elaine was quiet in a way I recognized. She wasn't shocked anymore. She was thinking. What? I asked. Did she say signed away that right? Yes. And those were her exact words. As exact as I can remember. Another pause, then, Carol, I think I know what this might be. I sat up straighter in the driver's seat. Outside the windshield, the parking lot was turning gold with evening light. Somebody across from me was loading a walker into the back of an SUV. The ordinariness of the scene made what Elaine sigh. Next feel even stranger. She may have seen the emergency guardianship papers. For a moment, I couldn't speak. Not because I didn't remember the papers. I did. I remembered them so clearly my hands went cold all over again. I remembered a cramped legal aid office with beige walls. I remembered signing my name while my lip was split and my right side ached every time I breathed too deeply. I remembered a woman from the shelter explaining temporary custody in a voice so gentle it made everything feel even more frightening. I remembered Elaine taking Hannah for 11 days while I moved into a furnished apartment under a protection order and waited for the court hearing that would keep Richard from taking her out of state. I remembered all of that. What I had not remembered, until Elaine said it, was how that paperwork might look to someone who had only seen one page. My signature, the word guardianship, my child's name. I never told her, I whispered. I know. I didn't want her to carry that. I know. I closed my eyes. Do you think he showed her? Elaine let out a slow breath. If he did, he didn't show her the whole thing. That night, I pulled an old plastic storage bin from the hall closet and set it in the middle of my living room floor. Divorce papers, tax returns, school records, Hannah's vaccination cards, report cards, art projects with macaroni glued in shapes I once knew by heart. I knelt there for hours, lifting one file at a time, dust sifting into the late lamplight. The house was so quiet I could hear the refrigerator cycle on and off from the kitchen. There is something brutal about searching your own past for evidence that you are not who your child has been told you are. I found photographs first. Hannah at 4 in red rain boots standing in a puddle and laughing up at me. Hannah at 7 missing her front teeth. Hannah at 10 in a homemade Halloween costume, arms folded because the fairy wings embarrassed her until she saw everyone admiring them. Then letters, school newsletters. A Mother's Day card from 2nd grade that said, "My mom makes the best pancakes and gives good hugs." I had to stop then, press the heel of my hand against my eyes, breathe through the ache. Around 11:30, I found a manila folder labeled Legal 1998. Inside were copies of the divorce decree, the visitation order, a few handwritten notes from my old attorney, and one photocopy of a court form so faded I could barely read it. Emergency Temporary Guardianship Petition. My name. Elaine's name. Hannah's full little name in formal type. The bottom half of the second page was missing. I sat back on my heels. There it was, the paper ghost of the thing that could ruin a mother if shown without context. I remembered exactly why it had been necessary. Richard had found the apartment where I was staying after I left him. He'd pounded on the door for 20 minutes while Hannah cried in the bedroom. 2 days later, he told me if I tried to keep her from him, he would take her to his brother's place in Kentucky, and I'd spend a year begging a judge to see her. The shelter advocate said the fastest protection, while the restraining order processed, was to place temporary emergency guardianship with a neutral adult he couldn't legally challenge as easily in the first 72 hours. Elaine, it was never a surrender. It was a shield. A brief, desperate legal step taken by a bruised woman trying to keep a man from disappearing with her child. But if you didn't know that, if all you saw was my signature under legal language, you might imagine something else. And Richard had always understood the power of partial truth. In some ways, partial truth was his favorite weapon. A lie has to work too hard. A partial truth can sit there and let your own fear finish the job. I called in sick the next morning and drove to Elaine's house. She lives 40 minutes away in a ranch house with blue shutters and a vegetable garden that always does better than mine. When I pulled up, she was already on the porch in a sweatshirt, coffee mug in hand, as if she'd been watching for me. She hugged me once tightly, then led me inside without too much talk. Elaine knows when words help and when they just create noise. We sat at her kitchen table with the old folder between us. Morning light came through the curtains in pale strips. A radio played softly in the other room. She put on reading glasses and studied the photocopy while I wrapped my hands around the mug she'd made me. "He had to get this from somewhere," she said. "I never kept my copy. I didn't even remember I had one." He may have had access back then, or he could have requested archived records later. I looked up, can he do that? If he was a named party in the underlying case, maybe. Or maybe he kept a copy all along. The thought made me feel sick. Richard, with that file stored somewhere for years, waiting for the right moment, waiting until Hannah was pregnant and tender and looking backward at motherhood with new eyes. Waiting until a story about what it means to choose or not choose a child would cut the deepest. Elaine looked at me over the rims of her glasses. Has Hannah said anything else? Any exact phrase? I thought back. A week ago, she said something strange when I offered to help organize the nursery closet. She said, "Some choices leave marks even when everybody pretends they don't." I asked what that meant, and she said I was being defensive. Elaine's mouth hardened. That sounds coached. I know. We both sat with that. The hardest part of being misrepresented to someone you love is not just the lie itself. It is hearing the borrowed language in their mouth, sensing another person's hand in the shape of their hurt. Hannah had always had her own way of speaking, direct, warm, a little dry when she was teasing. The last few weeks there had been something heavier in her phrasing, almost courtroom-like. Final, moral, like a verdict she had rehearsed. Elaine reached for the phone. "We need the full record." By noon, she had tracked down the county archive office. The original file had been moved to off-site storage years ago. They could retrieve it, but it would take 2 to 3 business days. I wrote down the request number in my notebook like it was a lifeline. Then I did something I had not done in years. I drove past Richard's house. Not because I had a plan. Not because I thought I'd go in. I just needed to see where my daughter had been spending so much time. Needed to confirm with my own eyes that this wasn't all some terrible misunderstanding. He lives now in a renovated farmhouse 10 miles outside town, the kind of place men like him buy later in life because it photographs well and gives the impression of depth. Wraparound porch, black shutters, gravel drive, a boat he uses 3 times a summer and talks about all year. When we were married, he hated mowing a lawn smaller than my current living room. Now he posts pictures of himself stacking firewood like a man who has always belonged to the earth. I parked on the road a little ways down and watched from behind the wheel. There was Hannah's car, unmistakable. The silver SUV Nate bought last year when they found out they were trying for a baby. A wind chime moved on the porch. A golden retriever I didn't know Richard had trotted through the yard with a tennis ball in its mouth. For one wild second, I imagined getting out and marching up the driveway and demanding to know what he had done. But age teaches you that walking straight into manipulation only feeds it. So I stayed in the car. A few minutes later, the front door opened. Hannah came out first, one hand at the small of her back. Nate followed carrying a cardboard box. Richard came behind them, smiling in that easy, paternal way strangers would read as warmth and I now read as choreography. He touched Hannah's shoulder as he spoke. She nodded. Then, as Nate loaded the box into the back of the SUV, Hannah leaned into Richard and hugged him. I looked away. That was the humiliating part nobody talks about enough. Not just being hurt by your child, but seeing the comfort she seeks in the person who caused so much of the damage you spent years quietly absorbing. It doesn't make you jealous. Not exactly. It makes you tired in a very old place. It makes you realize how often mothers are expected to swallow the backstory so their children can have uncomplicated love. On the drive home, I remembered a spring evening when Hannah was 9 and came back from a weekend with Richard asking why I had made Daddy leave. She said it casually, pulling sneakers off by the door, not knowing the force of it. I had stood there with her backpack in one hand and said, "Grown-up things are complicated, sweetheart." She shrugged and went to wash her hands for dinner. That was how I handled almost everything about Richard. I translated. I softened. I erased my own edges so she could feel safe loving both parents. For years, I believed that was the noble thing to do. Now I'm not so sure. The archived file took 4 days instead of 3, 4 very long days. In that time, Hannah did not contact me once. I sent nothing. Every instinct in me wanted to break, to send paragraphs, to defend myself, to insist, to demand explanation. But there is a point in certain kinds of pain where too much reaching only confirms the story being told about you. Richard would expect me to chase. He would expect tears, anger, impulsive messages he could hold up as proof that I was unstable or guilty, or making it all about myself. A phrase men like him love when women ask to be seen clearly. So I kept quiet and let the waiting do its work on me. Silence is not empty when you are frightened. It is crowded. Every memory you didn't know was still alive begins moving around inside you. I found myself remembering details I had not touched in years. The apartment I moved into after leaving Richard had green carpet and a dent in the kitchen linoleum shaped like a shoe heel. Hannah slept the first few nights on a little mattress on the floor because her bed frame didn't arrive yet. She kept asking when we were going home, and I kept saying, "We are home," in a voice more cheerful than I felt. The shelter counselor had given me a list of routines to keep everything stable for her. Same cereal bowl, same bedtime song, same stuffed rabbit. Stability as strategy, love as repetition. I remembered the legal aid office. A woman named Marisol with kind eyes and a navy blouse sat beside me and slid the guardianship papers across the table. She said, "This is temporary, Carol. It creates a short barrier while the order is served and we get the judge's hearing date confirmed." I remember looking at the word guardianship and feeling sick, as if language itself had failed me. There should have been another word, something that meant I am not giving up my child, I am hiding her from danger long enough to breathe. But legal systems are not designed for emotional accuracy. They reduce terror to boxes and signatures. I remembered Elaine taking Hannah for those 11 days, how I folded tiny socks into a duffel bag with my hands shaking. How Hannah cried because she thought she was in trouble. How Elaine crouched down and said, "No, honey, you get to stay with Aunt Lainey and watch movies and eat macaroni in the blue bowl." How I smiled until the door closed, then slid down the wall in the hallway and sobbed so hard I thought I might tear in half. And after all that, after surviving it, after rebuilding a life one quiet bill payment at a time, one school recital, one packed lunch, one parent-teacher conference, one night shift, one Christmas at a time, my daughter now believed I had signed her away. On Friday afternoon, the county clerk called and said the file was ready. I drove there with Elaine. The records office was in the basement of the old courthouse, the part of town where the buildings still have carved stone around the doors and the elevators take too long. We sat at a laminate table under humming fluorescent lights while a young clerk in a gray cardigan wheeled out a cart stacked with archive boxes. She was polite in the detached way of people who handle other families' hardest days as paperwork. "Take your time," she said. The file was thicker than I expected. There were court motions, witness statements, police reports, photographs I had forgotten existed, copies of letters, even a note from Hannah's pediatrician documenting behavioral distress after one of Richard's pickups. Elaine and I sat side by side turning pages with a care I usually associate with old photographs or fragile heirlooms. Only these were fragments of a life I had once had to survive. Then we found it, the full emergency guardianship petition. Page 1, my name, Elaine's name, Hannah's name. Page 2, clear as daylight, temporary emergency placement, requested due to credible threat of parental abduction and domestic violence by father, Richard Allen Mercer. Page 3, duration not to exceed 90 days without further order. Page 4, supplemental note from shelter legal advocate stating petitioner seeks immediate return to maternal custody upon service of protective order. There it was, the whole truth in black ink, not pretty, not easy, but true. I put my hand flat on the paper to steady myself. Elaine whispered, "Oh, honey." I kept reading. There was more. An affidavit from the responding officer from the night Richard pounded on the apartment door. A handwritten note from my old attorney summarizing a phone call in which Richard threatened to make her lose the kid if she thinks she can embarrass me in court. A certified mailing receipt showing the protection order had been served 2 days after the guardianship filing. An order returning full custody directly to me less than 2 weeks later. 11 days. 11 days had been turned into abandonment in my daughter's mind. I felt rage then, but not the hot kind, the mature kind, the cold, exact kind that arrives late and doesn't waste motion. I realized I was not dealing with a misunderstanding. I was dealing with a campaign. Richard had not simply answered a question carelessly. He had curated evidence. The clerk came by to ask if we needed copies. My voice sounded strangely normal when I said yes. "Certified copies, please, all relevant custody and protection filings from this period." She nodded and rolled the card away. While we waited, Elaine found something else buried deeper in the file. A statement from my neighbor at the apartment complex, a retired school principal named Mrs. Fenwick, who had witnessed Richard grabbing my arm in the parking lot during the separation. I had forgotten she wrote one. People step briefly into your worst chapters and then disappear into the years, and sometimes all that remains is a paragraph in a court file proving you were not imagining your own life. We carried the copies out in a large envelope. On the courthouse steps, I sat down because my legs had gone weak. It was one of those windy spring days where the sky looks scrubbed clean and the air still has winter tucked inside it. Cars moved along the street. Somewhere nearby, a church bell rang the hour. I held the envelope on my lap and felt almost nothing for a minute. Then, slowly, I began to understand what I had in my hands. Not just proof, permission. Permission to stop protecting the person who had built his reputation partly on my silence. That evening, Nate called me. I almost didn't answer because I thought it might be a robocall. When I saw his name, my whole body tightened. "Hi," I said. He sounded tired. "Carol." He always called me Carol, not Mom or anything sentimental, but there had been warmth in it before. Now there was caution. Still, caution was better than contempt. "Yes." "I shouldn't be calling behind Hannah's back," he said. "I'm not trying to create more problems." I waited. He exhaled. "I just need to ask you something directly." "Okay." A pause, then, carefully. "Did you ever try to sign away your rights to Hannah when she was little?" Even with the envelope sitting right beside me on the kitchen table, the question landed like a slap. "No," I said, "never." Another pause. "That's what I thought." I leaned forward. "Nate, what exactly has she been told?" He hesitated long enough that I could hear his refrigerator humming through the phone on his end. "Richard showed her some documents. He said that when you left, you were planning to move to California with someone and you didn't want to raise her. He said he stopped it, that he stepped in so she wouldn't be put with relatives permanently." I closed my eyes. California, there it was, the old affair fantasy. Richard had accused me of wanting to run off with a man from work because I once laughed too long at a joke during an office holiday lunch. There had never been another man. There had barely been enough room in my life then for sleep. "I never planned to go anywhere," I said, "and there was no someone." "I figured," Nate said quietly. "Some of the story didn't add up. But Hannah's, she's pregnant, she's emotional, and Richard keeps acting like he's finally telling her this painful truth he hid to protect her." Of course he did. Martyrdom fits men like Richard better than apology ever could. "Did he show her the whole file?" I asked. "I don't know, I only saw 2 pages. One had your signature." "Did it mention domestic violence?" "A beat, no." "Did it say temporary emergency guardianship?" "I saw the word guardianship, that's all." I looked down at the certified copies. My own name stared back up at me from 30 years ago, younger and shakier, and so determined to keep going she signed whatever was required. "Nate," I said, "I have the full court record." He was silent. "It shows exactly why those papers were filed. It shows who the danger was." He let out a long breath. I thought there had to be more. "I don't know if Hannah will believe me now." "She might not at first," he said honestly, "but I think she needs to see it." His honesty hurt and helped at the same time. That is one of the adult griefs nobody prepares you for. Sometimes the kindest thing someone can offer is not reassurance, but accuracy. "Will you talk to her?" I asked. "I will try." I thanked him. After we hung up, I sat at the table for a long time with the phone in my hand. Something didn't feel right. That phrase had been haunting me for weeks, but now it shifted shape. Before, it described my daughter's behavior. Now it described the entire architecture of the lie. Richard hadn't just told her a story. He had waited until her body and mind were already opened by the idea of motherhood. He had made my past sound like a moral failure right as she herself was becoming a mother, because that is when the accusation would sink deepest. He hadn't chosen this moment accidentally. He had chosen it because pregnant daughters think about origin stories. They think about who held them, who wanted them, who would protect them. He had reached into that sacred mental space and planted poison there. That realization did something important to me. It burned away the last of my confusion. I was not dealing with an interpersonal misunderstanding. I was dealing with an act of cruelty. The weekend passed with no word from Hannah. I vacuumed the living room. I washed sheets. I bought groceries I barely touched. I went to church Sunday and sat in the back because I didn't trust my face. After the service, Mrs. Donnelly from choir asked how Hannah was feeling. I said, "She's doing okay," and felt how exhausting it is to keep other people comfortable while your own life is on fire. Monday morning, Hannah finally texted. "Nate says you have papers." I stared at the screen so long it dimmed. "Yes," I wrote, "full certified copies from the court archive. I would like you to see them." Another long silence. Then, "I don't want excuses." I typed and deleted 3 responses before sending. "These are not excuses. They are records." She did not answer again until evening. "Drop them off tomorrow. I'll read them when I'm ready." I should have felt relieved. Instead, I felt strangely numb. There are moments when a door opens just enough for you to step through, but you know the room beyond it may still contain everything you fear. The next day, I drove to her house after work. Hannah and Nate live in a new development on the edge of town where all the houses are variations on the same 3 ideas. White trim, black shutters, small trees staked upright in the front yards. Their porch had a doormat that said "Hello, baby" in looping script. I stood there holding the envelope and felt my chest tighten so hard I had to pause before ringing the bell. Nate answered. His face looked drawn. "Hi," he said softly. "Hi." He stepped aside. "She's in the kitchen." The smell of tomato soup and grilled cheese was in the air, and something about that nearly undid me because Hannah had loved tomato soup on rainy days since she was 4. Some habits survive so much. I followed Nate down the hall and saw her sitting at the table in a loose gray sweater, both hands wrapped around a mug. For a second, I just looked at her. Pregnancy had rounded her face a little. There was a tiredness around her eyes I had not earned the right to ask about anymore. Her hair was pulled back. She looked older than she had 6 weeks earlier and younger than she should have had to become all at once. She did not stand when I entered. I set the envelope on the table between us. "These are certified copies from the courthouse," I said. "Everything relevant from that period." She looked at the envelope but didn't touch it. "So I'm just supposed to believe paper." I sat down across from her because standing felt too much like looming. "No, you're supposed to read all of it before you decide who I am." Her jaw tightened. "That's dramatic." I almost laughed at that, not because it was funny, but because I had spent half my life being accused of drama for bringing facts into rooms built on denial. "Hannah," I said, and kept my voice level, "I am not asking you to forgive me for something I did. I am asking you to stop judging me for something I didn't." She finally put a hand on the envelope. "Dad says you're going to make him look like a monster because you can't handle being confronted." There it was, the borrowed language again. I noticed something in myself then, a surprising steadiness. Pain, yes, but also steadiness. Maybe because hearing his patterns in her mouth no longer confused me, it clarified the terrain. "I'm not interested in making him anything," I said. "I'm interested in you seeing the whole truth." She slid the envelope toward herself. "I need you to go." Nate looked at me apologetically. I stood. My knees were weak, but my voice held. "Read page 2 before anything else," I said, "and page 4. She didn't answer. I left. The next 24 hours stretched like a wire. At 7 the next morning, I checked my phone before I even put on my glasses. Nothing. At lunch, nothing. By 5:30, still nothing. I was chopping celery for chicken salad when the phone rang. Hannah. I nearly dropped the knife. "Hello." Her breathing came first, then, "Why didn't you tell me?" I closed my eyes. "Tell you what, sweetheart? That he hit you." The words were so blunt, so young and old at the same time, that my grip on the counter tightened. I leaned my free hand against the kitchen wall. "Because you were a child." "I'm not a child now." "No," I said, "you're not." She was crying then, but trying not to. I could hear that old lip-pressing effort in the shape of her breath. He told me you left because you wanted another life. He said you asked Anna Lane to take me because you couldn't do it anymore. I know what he told you. Why didn't you ever say anything? How do mothers answer that honestly without sounding like martyrs? I could have said because I wanted you to love your father without feeling guilty. Because I was tired of dragging darkness into every room. Because survival took so much energy, I mistook silence for healing. Because women of my generation were trained to think protecting children always meant withholding the ugliest truths, even when the withholding left space for lies. Instead, I said, because I thought sparing you the details was kinder. She let out a sound halfway between a laugh and a sob. It was. No, I thought it was. I know, I said. She was quiet for a long time. Then, he said the police report was exaggerated. He said you knew how to cry on command. That one still had power, even now. Not because I believed it, but because it was one of Richard's oldest tricks. Describe your pain as performance. Make your grief look strategic. Reduce your fear to theatrics. It is astonishing how many institutions are ready to believe men when they say a woman is too emotional instead of asking what made emotion necessary. Hannah, I said gently, did you read the statement from Mrs. Fenwick, the neighbor? Yes. And the mailing receipt for the protective order? Yes. Another silence. I called him, she said. Of course she had. A daughter in shock will still reach for the parent whose version of reality feels easier to survive. What did he say? He said you kept records because you were obsessed. He said none of that changes the fact that you left me with Elaine. I looked out the kitchen window at my maple tree moving in the wind. I left you with Elaine for 11 days because the court process was not fast enough to keep you safe from him. I cried every night you were there. I visited twice. I called every day. And the minute the order was served, I brought you home. She started crying again in earnest then, not loud, not dramatic, just that broken, trying to breathe crying that sounds almost private even on the phone. I stood there and let her have it. Finally, she said, I don't know what to do. That sentence, more than any apology could have, told me she was beginning to come back to herself. Certainty had cracked, and when certainty cracks, truth has somewhere to enter. You don't have to know tonight, I said, but you do need to stop letting him tell this story alone. She didn't answer, but she didn't hang up either. After that call, things did not magically repair. Real life is slower than that. Hurt resists tidy endings. Humiliation doesn't dissolve because facts arrive. And once distrust enters a relationship between mother and daughter, it doesn't politely leave when corrected. It lingers in the corners. It tests every new softness. For the next week, Hannah and I spoke in short, careful exchanges. She asked questions in bursts, often late at night. Was he always like that? Did you ever think about taking me farther away? Why did Grandma know? Did you ever hate me because I looked like him? That last question broke something open in me. I answered immediately, never, not once. Sometimes I was scared because I knew he would use his access to you to stay in my life. Sometimes I was tired. Sometimes I was lonely in ways I hid from everyone. But I never hated one thing about you, not your face, not your voice, not the fact that part of you came from him. You were never the problem. She didn't respond for a full hour. Then, I needed that to be true. I sat in the dark living room reading those words over and over until the phone blurred in my hand. Looking back, I think that was the true center of the wound, more than the paperwork, more than the lie itself. My daughter, on the edge of motherhood, had begun to fear that she had once been unwanted. Everything else radiated from that. All the coldness, the withdrawal, the public cruelty at the shower, it came from a place far beneath anger. It came from primal hurt. Once I understood that fully, I stopped needing her apology to come before my compassion. I could see the woman and the little girl in her at once. But compassion is not the same as surrender. The more we talked, the clearer it became that Richard had not simply, finally told her. He had spent weeks building the case. He'd shown her those 2 pages after inviting her over for Sunday pot roast. He'd acted reluctant, wounded, noble. Told her he never wanted to burden her with the truth. Told her he only felt she deserved to know now that she was becoming a mother herself. He said things like, "I protected you from this because I knew how sensitive you were, and your mother has always had a way of rewriting hard things." He'd let tears gather in his eyes. Hannah told me all this in fragments, ashamed as she said it, and I could hear how carefully he had staged every beat. He had also enlisted his wife, Denise, who told Hannah that some women aren't built for the sacrifices of motherhood, and that Richard did what he had to do back then. I wasn't surprised. Denise had married a version of him already polished by age, his worst edges dulled by time and better public habits. Or maybe she knew exactly who he was and had built her own peace around not naming it. Women do that too. We all make our bargains somewhere. One evening, Hannah came over unexpectedly. It was raining lightly, the kind that mists more than falls. I heard her car door shut and looked out to see her standing in my driveway with no umbrella, one arm over her stomach, hair damp at the temples. I opened the door before she reached the porch. She looked tired and young and furious all at once. "Can I come in?" "Always." She stepped inside and stood awkwardly in the entryway, as if she had forgotten the shape of my H. Ooze. I took her sweater and hung it on the hook by the door. She looked around, eyes catching on familiar things, the framed photo from her college graduation, the old ceramic rabbit from her childhood dresser, the Afghan draped over the couch back. Home, but not simple. "I don't want tea," she said before I could ask. "Okay." "I'm not staying long." "Okay." We went to the living room. She remained standing. I sat because I sensed she needed the height advantage. "I called Anna-Lane," she said. My heart kicked once. "How is she?" She told me what those 11 days were like. I waited. "She said you showed up at her house on day 3 with all my laundry folded in separate stacks because you were worried she wouldn't know which pajamas I liked." Hannah laughed once, sharply, then wiped under one eye. "She said you left notes in every bag, one for bath time, one for bedtime, one for what cereal I'd actually eat." I looked down at my hands. I had forgotten the notes. "She said you kept asking whether I was sleeping with the rabbit tucked under my chin because that's how I slept when I felt insecure." Hannah's voice cracked on the word insecure. "She said you called so often, she finally told you to stop apologizing and go eat something." I still didn't speak. Sometimes telling the truth again requires quiet more than explanation. Hannah folded her arms over herself. Why would he do this? There are questions adult daughters ask that no mother is ever fully prepared to answer. I could have given the clinical version: control, image management, unresolved resentment, fear of losing influence. I could have dressed it in therapy language and tried to make it sound neutral and processed. Instead, I said, because some people would rather rearrange the past than face what they did in it. She stared at me. Rain tapped the windows behind her. "And because," I added, "you were about to become a mother. That meant your attention was shifting. Your loyalty was shifting. He felt it." She sat down then, heavily, as if pregnancy and grief had both finally claimed their full weight. I told everyone at the shower. I kept my face still, though the memory of that room flashed through me. "I know." "I made you look," she stopped. "You made me look guilty," I said quietly, because sometimes honesty is kinder than rescue. Her eyes filled. "I thought you were." I nodded once. "I know." That was the beginning of the real conversation, and it lasted nearly 3 hours. She asked me about the marriage, not for spectacle, not for gossip. With the solemn, searching face of a woman trying to understand the architecture she grew up inside without being shown the beams, I told her about the early charm, the jokes, the way Richard brought coffee to my desk when we were dating, the way he remembered my birthday down to the hour I was born, the first time he humiliated me in public and later convinced me I was too sensitive, the way his anger always seemed accidental until I noticed it only arrived when I had needs of my own. The night he threw a glass against the kitchen cabinet 6 inches from my head. The month I started hiding cash in an old flour tin because I knew one day I might need to leave quickly. The way fear can become normal if it is introduced gradually enough. Hannah listened with both hands clasped around one knee, not interrupting except to ask a question now and then. Once she covered her mouth and looked away. Once she said, very softly, "I remember you flinching when doors slammed." I had not known she remembered that. "I also need you to hear this," I said at one point. Leaving him didn't make me perfect afterward. I was exhausted. I was sharp sometimes. I cried in the bathroom where you couldn't see me. There were nights I fed you macaroni 3 times a week because it was all I could manage. I'm not telling you I was some saint. I'm telling you the thing he said, the thing about me not wanting you, was never true. She nodded through tears. I believe you. I didn't expect the relief of those 3 words to hurt as much as it did. There are forms of healing that arrive like warmth. This one arrived like bruising. I had wanted desperately to be believed, and when it finally happened, all the places that had been holding themselves rigid relaxed at once. I got up and walked to the kitchen under the pretense of getting water because I needed a second alone. At the sink, I gripped the counter and let myself cry as quietly as I could. When I came back with 2 glasses, Hannah was staring at the framed school picture on the bookshelf. The one from 3rd grade where her bangs were uneven because she cut them herself with craft scissors. "I'm so ashamed," she said. I handed her the water and sat down. "Shame isn't where I want you to stay." "But I humiliated you." "Yes," I said, "you did." She shut her eyes. I reached across the space between us and laid my hand over hers. "And we are. Going to tell the truth about that too." She looked at our hands like she had forgotten what my hand felt like on hers. "Are you mad?" I thought about it. "Yes," I said, "but not in the way you probably mean. I'm not interested in punishing you. I am angry that you believed something so devastating about me and never asked me directly before you judged me publicly. That matters. We're not going to pretend it doesn't." She nodded slowly. "Okay." That okay mattered almost as much as "I believe you." It meant she was willing to stand in the discomfort instead of rushing us toward a sentimental repair. By the end of the evening, we both knew one thing clearly: there would have to be a confrontation with Richard. Not for drama, not for revenge, for clarity. Lies grow best in private. He had used privacy to his advantage for decades. The story needed to be brought into the open while it was still hot enough to matter. "I don't know if I can do that," Hannah admitted. "Every time I'm around him now, I feel sick." "I'll do it with you," I said. She looked up. "I don't want him to turn it into a circus." "He will try," I said, "so we won't." That was the plan we made. Not a trap, not an ambush. A conversation in daylight with documents with Nate present and a lane if needed. Calm, specific, no shouting, no drifting into every old wound. Stay on the facts. Ask direct questions, require direct answers. In the days before it happened, I felt a strange mixture of dread and steadiness. There is power in finally having no illusions left. Richard could still hurt me, but he could no longer confuse me. I also began noticing something else. My entire life, I had measured peace by how little trouble I caused. Suddenly, I was measuring it by how little of myself I abandoned. That is a very different way to live. The confrontation happened on a Sunday afternoon at Hannah's house. She chose the location deliberately, neutral ground, not his carefully curated farmhouse, not my smaller, older home where he might still unconsciously expect me to defend my own walls. Her space, her table, her child's future in the next room, assembled in a white crib under a mobile of stitched clouds. When I arrived, Nate was setting out water glasses. Elaine sat near the window, straight-backed and unreadable. Hannah stood by the kitchen island in a loose olive dress, one hand on her hip, the other unconsciously rubbing the side of her stomach. She looked pale but resolved. Richard came 10 minutes later with Denise. The instant I heard his voice in the entryway, warm, confused, slightly amused, I felt my whole nervous system light up in recognition of an old enemy. "What's all this?" he said. "Family council." He stepped into the kitchen and stopped when he saw me. I had spent years imagining what it might feel like to face him with no dependency left between us. No shared bills, no custody negotiations, no young daughter absorbing every tone, just age, truth, and consequence. What surprised me most was how ordinary he looked. Smaller than memory, softer around the middle, hair mostly silver now. That same pleasant face so many people trusted on sight. Denise hovered close beside him in expensive flats, and a worried expression that I suspect she believed looked innocent. Hannah motioned toward the chairs. "Sit down." Something in her voice must have alerted him that charm alone wouldn't steer this. His smile faltered, then returned in a thinner form. We all sat. I placed the certified copies in a neat stack on the table. Richard looked at them and gave a little dismissive huff. "So that's what this is, Carol digging up old paperwork." "No," Hannah said before I could speak. "This is me finding out you left most of it out." That landed. I watched him calculate. He folded his hands. "Honey, I showed you what was relevant." "The part with Mom's signature?" she asked. "I showed you the painful part. I thought you deserved to know." My entire body went still. There it was, the script, noble suffering, protective father burdened by truth. It would have worked on me once, not now. I leaned forward slightly. "Richard, page 2 names you as the source of the emergency danger." He turned to me with the old half-smile. "Carol, please, we all know those filings were exaggerated." "No," Elaine said, her voice cut through the room like a clean line. "We don't." Richard's eyes flicked to her, irritated. "Elaine, you were always dramatic about this stuff. I took Hannah for 11 days because Carol was trying to keep you from taking her across state lines." He waved a hand. "That's your interpretation." "No," Hannah said, and slid page 2 across the table toward him. "This is the court S." He didn't pick it up. That small refusal told me more than any confession could have. Innocent people handling truth do not fear touching paper. Guilty people often act as though documents are beneath them. Nate spoke next, measured a ND-com, "Did you show her this page or not?" Richard looked at him as if mildly offended by the impertinence. "I don't answer to you." "No," Nate said, "but you do answer for what you told my wife." The room went so quiet, I could hear the refrigerator compressor click on behind us. Denise tried then. "I think everyone is very emotional, and maybe this isn't good for Hannah and her condition. There are phrases women use to protect a man while sounding maternal, and that was one of them. In her condition. As if pregnancy made my daughter too fragile for truth and therefore more available for manipulation." Hannah turned to her slowly. "Don't do that." Denise blinked. "Do what?" "Talk about me like I'm not the one who was lied to." Richard sat back in his chair. "I did not lie. Your mother left you with Elaine. That is a fact. At another time in my life, I might have lunged for the nuance too quickly. I might have tried to explain, defend, fill the room with context until the core got lost in the noise. But clarity had taught me restraint. Yes, I said, for 11 days under emergency legal protection while I got a restraining order served on you. That is also a fact. The question is why you showed our daughter the first fact without the second. He looked at me with naked dislike then, the kind he usually reserved for private moments when the mask slipped. Because you always wanted to be the victim. I felt Hannah jerk beside me, as if that sentence finally exposed a tone she had been sheltered from before. I kept my voice even. Answer the question. He laughed once under his breath. You want me to answer your question after 30 years of your version? No, Hannah said, mine. That word changed everything. Mine. Not his daughter as extension, not my daughter as wound, herself, her own claim to the truth. Richard turned to her, softening his face. Sweetheart, I was trying to protect you from how hard it is to realize your mother. Stop, she said. He stopped. It was the first time I had ever seen her interrupt him without apology. She pushed the papers closer. Her fingers were shaking, but her voice held. Did you show me the page that said there was domestic violence? Silence. Did you show me the page that said the guardianship was temporary and tied to the restraining order? Silence again. Did you tell me it lasted 11 days? He looked down, then back up with practiced injury. I told you what mattered. Hannah made a sound, small and devastated. To who? No one moved. He tried one last turn then, one I should have anticipated. Even if I didn't give every detail, that doesn't erase the fact that she made the choice to leave you with someone else. I saw Hannah's face harden at that, not toward me, but toward the ugliness of the logic itself. And in that moment, I understood something I wish I had understood much earlier in life. Truth does not always need embellishment to win. Sometimes all you have to do is let a lie keep talking until it exposes its own shape. I spoke quietly. Richard, I want to say this once, and I want you to hear it clearly. I did not leave my daughter because I didn't want her. I took legal steps for 11 days so you could not use her to control me. Those are not the same thing. They never were. And if you chose to make them sound the same to her now, during her first pregnancy, then what you did was not protection. It was cruelty. He scoffed, but it was weak. Denise reached for his arm. He pulled it away. Hannah was crying openly now, not little tears, the kind that come when your internal map tears in half. Nate moved his chair closer to hers, one hand at the back of her neck. She looked at Richard with a face I had never seen before, one stripped of daughterly reflex. You let me stand there and accuse her, she said. You let me humiliate her over something you knew you twisted. Richard leaned forward. I did not twist anything. Your mother has always been good at making herself look saintly. The sentence had barely left his mouth when Hannah stood up so suddenly, her chair scraped the floor. No, she said. What you're not going to do is use me to keep punishing her. I felt that all the way through my body, not because she was defending me in that moment, though she was, but because she was finally naming the pattern in her own language. That mattered more. Richard stood too. You are upset.